Welcome back again. Please comment down below what time it is, wherever you are right now, and press the like button. Let's start. The mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue sits silent, curtains drawn, 5 bodies hidden inside, and the father is gone without a trace. Officers cross the threshold of Breezy Knoll, hearing organ music echo on a timer, while the lights die room by room. 3 letters wait on a table: pastor, employer, school, each precise, chilling. Why plan this? Why the calm departure? Why no trace for 18 years? To understand the precision, we need to go back into a house built on rules, shame, and secrecy. Let's get to it. John Emil List learned early that rules protect you. In Michigan, in a strict Lutheran home, duty outranked feeling. He was a quiet boy who became a disciplined man, the kind of mind that thrived on columns and totals, predictability over risk. Accounting fit his temperament, the uniform of a respectable life, church on Sundays, routine on weekdays. The framework mattered. He met Helen, a widow with charm, and at first the marriage looked like stability. They built a family, Patricia, John Jr., Frederick, and they built an image. What stands out now in retrospect is that appearances were currency. A man's worth was measured by the lawn, the choir attendance, the reliability of a paycheck. The psychology of the moment is important. This was mid-century America, where a suburban house could promise safety, and where failure could feel like an indictment of character. They moved to Westfield, New Jersey, into a sprawling Victorian they named Breezy Knoll. It was a status symbol, stained glass, a ballroom, more house than most families would ever see. And yet, for all this, the math was fragile. Jobs came and went. He held positions in banking and accounting, but he never seemed to stay. When the last steady job slipped away, he didn't tell anyone. Instead, he put on the suit, picked up the briefcase, and left the house each morning. He rode the train, not to an office, but to Newark's station benches and libraries. He wrote resumes, sent letters, and as the weeks turned into months, he preserved the script. Each afternoon, he came home on schedule. Bills piled up. Savings bled out. He borrowed from his mother, Alma. He sold small life insurance policies. He told small lies, bridge loans, temporary setbacks, until the lies became the scaffolding of his life. What if the image mattered more than the truth? That question isn't just rhetorical, it's the trap. In a town like Westfield, a father's job anchored a family's social standing. His children were talented, Patricia in theatre, John Jr. in sports, Frederick studious, and the house hosted their ambitions. Meanwhile, Helen was struggling. Her health declined, her drinking increased, and marital life grew tense. There were whispers of an old illness, a diagnosis she'd concealed for years. He felt bound by vows, by religious doctrine, by the stigma of divorce. In his head, choice narrowed into duty. He started cutting corners in silence. The heat turned down. Groceries planned like inventory. The mortgage slipped behind. He stopped paying for certain utilities, then caught up, then slipped again. The pressure wasn't sudden. It was a slow crush. He kept attending church, pledged modestly, smiled, shook hands. Respectability, maintained at all costs. And yet, the inner voice sharpened. Better to suffer quietly than admit weakness. Here's where the mask hardened. He rehearsed contingencies. He thought about consequences. He feared humiliation, his children on welfare, as he put it later, a word he used like a threat. To him, public failure wasn't just financial, it was spiritual collapse. He believed sin crept through compromise. He believed that moral decay was ambient, waiting to swallow a family that drifted from the rules. The home itself turned into a ledger. Outgoing, tuition, utilities, groceries, mortgage, medical costs, incoming, dwindling savings, a mother's loans. The balance sheet never balanced. He tried to find new work, but his personality, controlled, aloof, worked against him in interviews. He was competent, but not magnetic, exact, but not adaptable. He'd sit, hands folded, and explain experience, while behind his eyes the arithmetic kept ticking. Meanwhile, small, unsettling moments accumulated. The kids asked about money. Helen's drinking led to arguments, slurred accusations that he was cold, withholding. He answered with silence, or with rules: no parties, no waste, no missed church. The house learned the shape of tension. In hindsight, The ritual of him leaving for a job he no longer had wasn't just deception. It was rehearsal for a deeper denial. What nobody knew at the time was that he'd started to plan beyond the job search. He cut delivery services, stopped the mail temporarily under plausible pretenses, and tracked the school schedules. He would know when each child came home. He would know which neighbor noticed which light. He tested the fuse box, learned which circuits fed the organ, which rooms would darken last. He wasn't improvising. He was building a system. And the theology? It twisted slowly. He told himself that protecting the family from shame was mercy. He told himself that financial collapse would destroy their souls. The vocabulary of salvation mixed with the arithmetic of debt. This is not an excuse. It's the tunnel he dug in his mind. The narrower it got, the more inevitable it felt. He'd always been the man who believed rules rescued people. He was about to enforce a rule that annihilated the very people he said he loved. As money thinned, the plan thickened, quietly, methodically. He didn't rush. He mapped. The first layer was silence. He visited the post office, arranged for a temporary hold under the pretext of travel, and noted the clerk's name so he could reference it later if anyone questioned him. Milk and newspaper deliveries were cancelled in staggered fashion, one this week, another the next, so any break in routine wouldn't signal an abrupt absence. He called the children's schools, calm, polite, saying a family trip was coming up, they might miss a few days. No drama, only notice. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the basement. He cleaned the handguns he'd bought years earlier, a 9mm and a .22, laid out ammunition by type, counted, recounted, and kept receipts out of sight. He visited a range, practiced his stance, controlled his breathing. The psychology of the moment is important. He needed to feel precise, because any surprise, any hesitation, could cause the plan to fracture. He timed himself from one floor to another, up to the third-floor suite where his mother lived, down to the ballroom where the space would hide bodies from a front door glance. He tested the house itself. In the fuse box, he traced circuits with a pencil diagram, learning which breaker fed the chandelier in the ballroom, which fed the pipe organ, which rooms could be kept dim while the organ still played. He discovered the organ's outlet sat on a different line. He could cut most lights and leave the timer to hum. This mattered. A house that sounded occupied might discourage a quick welfare check, at least for a while. He wrote letters and revised them. To the pastor, he confessed in his particular way, framing what he was going to do as protection, mercy, against the corruptions of the world. He wrote to his employer to finalize the fiction of departure, and to the schools, formal and tidy. The salutation, the punctuation, even the margins, were careful. He needed the record to read as if a thoughtful man had put his affairs in order, not as if a desperate one had snapped. Bank accounts came next. He closed what he could, transferred what might draw attention if it lingered, and planned cash withdrawals small enough to avoid a clerk's double take. He arranged his mother's affairs to keep her room separate, not just physically, but symbolically. He chose that third-floor suite because it kept her apart from the rest of the household, isolated, dignified, and, in his mind, less subject to the staging he planned downstairs. It's unsettling, the intimacy of that detail. He adjusted the children's schedules with subtle nudges. Patricia's drama club pickup, Frederick's after-school routine, John Jr.'s soccer practice. He knew who would be home when. He knew how much time lived between each arrival. He made sure no house guests would interrupt the flow. The careful pacing meant he could control each encounter, preventing a cascade of panic that would spill out of his control. The theology solidified. He read scripture with a lens that narrowed possibilities. He fixated on judgment, on avoiding moral decay, on the idea that suffering in this world can be a prelude to salvation. What stands out now in retrospect is that this wasn't a crisis epiphany. It was a slow editing of his beliefs, removing mercy from the equation while retaining the language of mercy. He convinced himself that a financial fall, public and humiliating, would ruin his children's prospects, maybe their souls. It's wrong, but it explains the tunnel he accepted. He also planned for time after. He priced bus fares, studied train routes that wouldn't require ID, and considered where a man with accounting skills and a quiet manner might disappear. Denver perhaps far enough with industry. He listed hotels that took cash, noted church addresses. He even considered what name might fit on a resume, what alma mater would withstand a cursory phone call. He wasn't fantasizing, he was engineering an erasure. Then he rehearsed the day. He would send the children to school. He would speak to Helen in the kitchen, where a single gunshot would be contained by doors and distance. He would go upstairs to his mother, whose limited mobility and trust in him made resistance unlikely. He would return to the first floor, clean, reset, wait. The house would remain orderly, the organ would play, the phone could be left to ring. And then came November 9th, 1971. The morning began with breakfast, routine and plain. He kept his voice even, his manner measured. He watched the clock more than the faces. He prompted goodbyes, tucked a strand of hair behind Patricia's ear, handed Frederick his lunch, wished John Jr. a good practice. He told them he'd see them later. He had already decided no one would come home again. Stakes first. 6 people lived inside Breezy Knoll, a wife whose health had faltered, a mother who trusted her son, and 3 children moving through the rituals of school and sports. The neighbors noticed patterns: trash day, choir nights, the clatter of kids' shoes in the hallway, but patterns can hide danger. If anything slipped, questions would arrive quickly. He couldn't allow that. Control would define the day. He started in the kitchen with Helen. After the children left for school, he stood close, within the length of a whisper. A single shot, near contact, fast. The sound was contained by walls he'd already mapped. Her body folded where she stood. He checked her pulse, then did something that reveals the calculated mind. He covered her face with a dish towel, not out of mercy, but to keep himself moving. Staging begins as self-management. Then he climbed the back stairs to the 3rd floor, to Alma's suite. She depended on him for the small chores of morning. That trust removed any barrier. He greeted her, stepped near, and fired at close range. 1 round was enough. The forensic reports later would note the angle, the distance, the cleanliness of it. He tried to move her, tested the weight, and stopped. Too heavy, too risky. He left her where she lay, a decision that served the narrative he intended. Mother apart, dignified, unreachable. Back downstairs, he cleaned. He wiped counters, put dishes away, mopped small arcs of blood that had travelled onto linoleum. He opened windows, then shut them, listening for voices outside, listening for the ordinary soundscape of Westfield. He changed clothes, folded the ones he'd stained, and placed them in a bag he could hide. He set the table as if lunch might happen. Order calmed him. Order also hides time. Next came the pickups, paced like a schedule he'd rehearsed. Patricia, the daughter immersed in theatre, returned first. He told her they needed to talk in the ballroom. It was a large room, echoing, more space than a family needed, and in his mind, it functioned like a stage that could absorb what happened. She walked where he asked. He raised the gun, fired. Close, controlled. He stayed near, waited, checked. Then Frederick, the same routine, quiet instructions, the same destination, another shot. The sequencing minimized noise and panic. There was no chase through hallways, no screaming heard by neighbors over leaf blowers and passing cars. Forensic details anchor this sequence. Ballistics linked rounds to his handguns. The absence of stippling on some wounds suggested a slight distance. On others, powder burns marked near contact. The bodies showed little evidence of struggle, which means he kept conversations short, tone flat, eyes fixed. He didn't argue with children. He directed them. The psychology of the moment is important. Deference to a parent can be a lethal advantage when the parent is the threat. John Jr. complicated the plan. He had soccer practice after school. That added time worked like acid on a mind, trying to control every variable. He drove to the field, waited, watched. Picture him rehearsing the next minutes in his head, down to the slow hinge sound of the side door when they arrived home. They walked in. The house was dim. He'd already cut some power. He steered his son toward the same ballroom. Something in the boy sensed wrong. A pause, maybe a question, maybe the smallest shift of weight. He fired. The first round didn't end it. Reports would note multiple wounds. There was movement, a struggle. He fired again, and again, until the body stopped resisting. That detail is stark. This was the longest fight of the day, the one moment where control faltered and force took its place. Then came the staging in full. He laid sleeping bags on the ballroom floor, arranged his wife and 2 younger children in a row, aligned feet and shoulders, like bodies prepared for a viewing without mourners. He added John Jr. to the line, adjusting for space, smoothing clothing, folding hands that no longer held tension. He left Alma upstairs, a deliberate separation. He shut the ballroom doors, not locked, but heavy, creating a barrier a casual visitor wouldn't cross. The stained glass skylight above, imported, rumoured to be from a church, cast a muted pattern on the floor. Beauty over horror, he cooked a meal. Investigators would later find evidence of recent food preparation, the normal smell of a house where dinner might still be served. He sat, wrote final letters, and refined the narrative of mercy he'd chosen. To the pastor, he explained the killings as a rescue from moral decay and financial ruin. He asked for prayers. The language was formal, composed, not frantic. He placed checks, closed accounts, made notes about where to find things. He cut the heat to save fuel, cut selective lights to mask the darkness with texture, then set the organ to a timer. Music as camouflage. A slow hymn drifting through hallways would suggest life, even as life ended behind a ballroom door. He cleaned again. He gathered shell casings where he could, knowing some would hide under baseboards. He washed the floor where blood had pooled, knowing staining remained below the eyeline. He placed mail where it would support the story of travel. He left the radio on in one room, off in another, an arrangement mimicking occupancy. He pressed his hand against the front door, held still, listened to the street, tires on asphalt, distant voices, a dog. Nothing rose against him. The impact is hard to overstate. He sealed a room with 4 of his family and left his mother alone above them, then wrote a packet that sought absolution inside doctrine. When he finally stepped across the threshold and pulled the door shut, he wasn't running. He was exiting a stage he had set, counting on routine to shield the truth for days. The house would wait, silent, music on a timer, while Westfield kept moving around it. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual, a phone call missed, a shift at work skipped, a neighbour's concern building over days. At Breezy Knoll, the silence felt absolute. The organ's timer kept humming. The lights, once left on to mimic life, began to burn out, bulb by bulb. Mail accumulated in the box, then on the stoop, then in a damp stack, edges curling. A milk delivery never retrieved turned sour, a small, pungent alarm. Neighbours tried polite knocks, then firmer ones. From the sidewalk, the house still offered the outline of normalcy, curtains drawn, a silhouette of the organ visible if you knew where to look. But there were tells. No children crossing the front walk, no car doors slamming at dinner, no Helen at the window. Church friends noticed empty pews. The psychology of the moment is important. People in close suburbs assume the best until the evidence gets inconvenient. A teacher at the high school called the list home when Patricia missed class, then called again and again. At the bank, someone noted an account gone quiet. A relative reached out, got no response. Individually, none of these were decisive, but together they formed a picture even the polite couldn't ignore. Finally, after nearly a month, police were asked to do a welfare check. The request wasn't dramatic. It was weary. Officers arrived to a house sealed in its own routine. The front door resisted. A side entrance yielded after a forced entry, the wood crying out in a way the family hadn't. Inside, the air was still, cool without the heat, carrying a faint mix of wax, old food, and something else that makes officers share looks without words. The organ played a slow hymn, mechanical and indifferent. Room by room, they moved carefully, calling out names, hands on holsters, eyes catching on made beds and a too-clean kitchen. They found the freezer first. Food labelled and stacked, meals planned for a future that never arrived. Then they saw the note packet laid out with intent, letters addressed to the pastor, to employers, to schools. Formal, precise. A troubling stillness clung to the ballroom doors. When they opened them, the scene answered every question and created 100 more. 4 bodies on sleeping bags, aligned and solemn under the stained glass skylight's muted tint. Alma upstairs, discovered moments later, alone where trust had ended. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, not because the facts aren't known, but because explaining the calm staging doesn't reach the human cost. Detectives catalogued everything: the angles of entry wounds, the lack of ransacking, the absence of forced internal doors. Ballistics began to tie the rounds to the handguns registered to the father who wasn't there. The confession letter to the pastor reframed murder as mercy, debt as damnation, and escape as stewardship. It was chilling, meticulous, and deeply self-excusing. The immediate manhunt moved fast. Airports flagged the name. Bus and rail depots received bulletins. Agents checked bank activity, credit inquiries, safe deposit boxes. Nothing. He'd anticipated the simple nets, ID checks, fresh withdrawals, routine inquiries, and stepped outside their reach. The house told investigators that the plan didn't end at the ballroom. It extended far beyond the front door. Meanwhile, Westfield absorbed the shock. The church rang with whispered prayers and stunned anger. Classrooms carried an empty desk like a wound. Reporters gathered at the curb. Cameras pointed at the solemn facade. The phrase "without a trace" wasn't a cliché here. It was the reality. There was a name, a face, a paper trail of faith and routine, and yet no man to arrest. He had prepared for this, building not just a crime, but an erasure that would hold for years. He left Westfield quietly, not sprinting, but moving with calculated restraint. Bus first, then another, stitching distance with cash and patience. He avoided airports, avoided any ticket that demanded a name anyone in New Jersey would recognize. Denver sat far enough from Westfield to feel unreachable, yet ordinary enough to swallow a man who liked rules. Cheap rooms came next, weekly motels with thin walls and cash drawers that didn't care who you were if you paid on time. He ironed shirts on a motel desk, mended a cuff, polished shoes, rituals that made the mirror return a familiar, orderly face. The psychology of the moment is important. A ritual can steady the hands after what those hands have done. He needed a name. There was a man he'd once known at the University of Michigan, Robert Peter Clark, ordinary, respectable, a name that moved without friction. He adopted it, not with flourish, just with paperwork where it was minimal, and conversations where the truth didn't matter. He carried a resume that was specific enough to look real and vague enough to evade a diligent reference check. Accountancy, bookkeeping, audit support, jobs that trust numbers more than charm. Work arrived in small pieces, temp assignments first, then something steadier, often through agencies that prized punctuality and neat columns over personal history. He arrived early, stayed late, said little. Employers described him as reliable, quiet, a man who didn't bring problems to the office. What stands out now in retrospect is that he recreated the same profile he'd perfected in Westfield, minus the financial sinkhole and the looming choir of neighbors. Church followed because he needed it. Not only as shelter, but as identity. He joined congregations with the same careful smile, the same handshake, the same polite offers to help count offerings or chair a committee. He was congenial in a restrained way, reserved yet present. He folded into community rhythms, holiday potlucks, Wednesday meetings, Sunday coffee urns. People knew him as Bob, the man who liked order. Nobody asked for a past if the present stayed immaculate. Meanwhile, Westfield's breezy knoll transformed into a haunting. The property sat heavy with rumor. By 1972, it burned in a suspicious fire, erasing the ballroom where 4 sleeping bags had lined up under stained glass. Arson was suspected, but not charged to him. The ghost story remained, even as the physical house vanished. Across the country, he watched the news sparingly, never lingering on segments that might say his old name out loud. He remarried. In Denver, he met Dolores, a woman who valued steadiness, and he offered it, meticulously. They married in a small ceremony, no dramatic displays. The new household migrated east, first to Colorado suburbs, then eventually to Virginia, always with the same pattern, the same measured life. Neighbors saw a couple that paid bills on time, trimmed hedges, waved, attended church, and kept to themselves. He smiled gently, wore thick glasses, and delivered the bland jokes of office kitchens without stepping into anyone's confidence. This is where the banality hardens. He lived a second life almost identical to the first, just without debt and without children who might disrupt the clean surface. He kept receipts in labeled envelopes, balanced checkbooks to the penny, and monitored calendars with the discipline of a man who feared loose ends. The vigilance didn't sleep. Any unexpected ring at the door or unexpected letter in the mailbox drew a quiet spike of adrenaline he learned to hide by adjusting his glasses, smoothing his tie, checking a thermostat he'd already checked. He joined new choirs, played the role of helpful congregant, and volunteered for tasks that built trust, ushering, counting, chairing small committees. People like that become fixtures, the ones others rely on without thinking. The analogy is simple. A well-placed book on a crowded shelf vanishes in plain sight. He became that book, its spine unremarkable, its contents unread. At work, he rose enough to be comfortable but not enough to attract attention. Supervisors praised his accuracy, sometimes noting he could seem distant. Colleagues remembered a cautious mouth set, the way he blinked behind thick lenses before offering an answer. He never boasted. He never hinted at past adventures. He constructed a life where nobody would ask, because he never offered a single story that demanded follow-up. Inside, What did he tell himself? He explained later that he'd feared welfare, moral decay, the erosion of his children's souls. But in this second life, morality reduced to punctuality and order, not remorse. He avoided confession beyond what was necessary to function. He didn't seek therapy, didn't unburden himself to pastors. He measured goodness in attendance and routine. Years slipped by. Birthdays, anniversaries, block parties he barely attended, Christmas services where he sang hymns about mercy and judgment with eyes half closed. He drove routes that avoided police-heavy corridors, renewed licenses promptly under the name he carried, and kept any government interaction as minimal as possible. If a form asked for too much, he found a different door. If a conversation turned probing, he rerouted it with a question, then a smile, then silence. Meanwhile, the case went cold in New Jersey. Detectives retired, files shifted shelves. A new generation heard fragments, the Westfield mansion, the letters, the organ on a timer, and treated it as a local legend. He relied on that slow drift, the way details get smudged by time. But here's the twist. In 1989, television turned cold cases into national puzzles. A show would ask America to look carefully at a face, then imagine it older. He didn't know it yet, but his order was about to meet an artist who understood how habit calcifies into bone. It starts with a sculptor staring at a ghost. In 1989, America's Most Wanted asked forensic artist Frank Bender to age a vanished face. A rigid accountant, Lutheran, rule-bound, last seen in 1971, Bender didn't just add wrinkles. He studied habit. Thick glasses would likely remain, he thought, but heavier frames. The jaw would soften, the eyelids droop. A cautious mouth set, lips pressed into a practiced, restrained line. Hairline receded, posture a bit stooped from years over ledgers. He even added a ring, because men like that remarry. What stands out now in retrospect is that Bender built a personality into bone. He asked, who would this man become after 18 years of vigilance? Not a biker, not a drifter, a clerk, a neighbor who waters the lawn in measured arcs. The psychology of the moment is important. Habits fossilize. He sculpted a bust, painted the skin tone, set the eyes to look slightly down, as if he were reading a form. When AMW aired the segment, they paired the bust with a reconstructed voice, the Westfield house, the ballroom, the letters. They asked viewers to look at the screen and recognize routine. While that was happening on television, a woman in Denver sat forward. She had known a man named Bob Clark, quiet, orderly, church-going. He'd lived in her building years earlier, then moved away. The bust looked like him, if you gave it a few more winters. She called the number. Tips pour in on shows like that, thousands. But this one wasn't vague. She had addresses, workplaces, the denomination of his church. She had a memory of his glasses, the way he blinked. Agents moved carefully. They traced Bob Clark to Midlothian, Virginia, a suburb outside Richmond, where he worked at an accounting firm and lived in a modest house with his wife, Dolores. They didn't kick doors. They watched. They compared a long-ago fingerprint card to a current set from a job application. Technical, routine cross-checking that doesn't draw attention. When they finally stepped into the office, they asked for Bob. He adjusted his glasses, the same settled expression Bender had sculpted months earlier. The arrest unfolded without spectacle. He denied at first, in the tone of a man correcting a clerical error. "I'm Robert Clark." But his hands told a different story, a tremor minute and controlled. At the field office, the prints matched. The erasure ended with ink on cards and a computer that didn't care about routine. He yielded, quietly, as if an audit had caught an irregularity he could no longer reconcile. Media pressure built fast. AMW reran the segment, now with the headline, "Captured." The composite bust sat next to the real face, the resemblance unsettling. It wasn't just the cheekbones, it was the habit etched into every feature. Reporters swarmed Westfield and Midlothian. Neighbors in Virginia described a courteous man, church active, punctual. Employers praised his accuracy, his calm. Congregants remembered him counting offerings, holding the door, never raising his voice. The contrast cut deep, banality in one column, carnage in the other. For investigators, the impact was tactical and cultural. Tactically, it proved that a national platform could revive cold cases by harnessing the public's pattern recognition, turning living rooms into forensic laboratories. Culturally, it showed how a face can carry a life's logic. Bender's choices, drooping eyelids, thicker glasses, that cautious mouth. weren't lucky guesses. They were deductions about a man who avoided attention by perfecting it. What happened next remains procedural but important. Extradition papers moved. New Jersey prepared charges. 5 counts of murder. Detectives dusted files, long-shelved, rechecked ballistics, catalogued the letters to the pastor and employers. Prosecutors read the confession's theology and noted its cold accounting of debt and sin. Defense counsel began to sketch a mind under pressure. Depression. A religious delusion. The stage shifted to a courtroom that would measure planning against remorse. And what about him? In interviews, he returned to the same words: welfare, shame, decay, as if repeating them could frame the acts as necessary. But here's the twist. He'd lived 18 years proving he could survive humiliation. False identities, small jobs, the constant risk of exposure. The fear he invoked in 1971 didn't end his life. It ended theirs. Court would decide the rest. The courtroom in Union County wasn't designed for philosophy, but that's what walked in with the evidence. 5 counts of murder, and a narrative that tried to turn execution into mercy. Prosecutors started with the ledger, the fuse box diagrams, the cancelled deliveries, the school calls, the ammunition receipts. Planning wasn't inference here, it was paperwork. Ballistics linked the 2 handguns to the wounds. The letters to the pastor and employers showed intention, not impulse. Defense counsel pivoted hard to psychology. They argued that he'd suffered a depressive break, a kind of fog where catastrophic thinking and religious delusion converged. They raised what sounded like a PTSD analogue, rooted in job loss, marital deterioration, chronic stress. He'd lived inside a theology that punished failure, they said, and believed he was saving his family from moral decay and the humiliation of welfare. Could that reduce culpability? But here's the twist. The state's timeline had no gaps for fog. He stopped the mail, staged the house, wrote formal notices, paced pickups. He ate after the killings, cleaned, set the organ timer. Jurors listened to the confession letter, its severe sentences, its claim that killing spared souls from worldly corruption. Then they saw the photographs. Sleeping bags aligned under stained glass. Alma separated upstairs. If this was a break, it was a break with a spreadsheet. Witnesses filled the room with the ordinary. Ministers described a man who attended regularly, who spoke softly about doctrine. Co-workers from earlier years remembered him as precise, withdrawn, unbending. Neighbors spoke about the quiet routine, the clipped hedges, the measured wave. The combination was unsettling because it asked a hard question. When does restraint become a mask for control? The psychology of the moment is important. The defense tried to expand the tunnel he'd built, to show how shame can narrow a person's choices until the worst option looks like relief. They brought in a psychiatrist who described rigid thinking patterns, catastrophic cognition, scrupulosity, religion filtered through obsession rather than compassion. The doctor acknowledged he planned, but argued that his belief structure and depressive state created a distorted moral calculus. Prosecutors answered with arithmetic. Distortion doesn't explain target practice. Delusion doesn't time staggered arrivals. Depression doesn't draft multiple letters with neat margins and precise punctuation. They emphasized the sequence with John Jr., multiple shots, a prolonged struggle, evidence that when control met resistance, he didn't stop. He escalated. That, the state argued, is not mercy. That's determination. The confession letter sat at the center like a black hole. He wrote about salvation, about avoiding hell, about sparing his children from the erosion of the 197 seconds. He asked the pastor for prayers. He apologized for leaving debts. He framed the murders as caretaking, as if murder could be domesticated by intention. Jurors read it, then heard the autopsy wounds. The gap between language and reality was the case. On cross, the prosecution pressed him. When he chose the third-floor suite for Alma, when he tested the fuse box, when he lied to schools about a trip, was he experiencing voices, visions? No. He spoke carefully, said he'd felt trapped, feared failure, feared public assistance. He didn't claim hallucination. Instead, he described a belief that God would forgive because motive mattered. The courtroom felt colder when he said it. And yet, for all this, the defense asked for understanding, not absolution. They pointed to an era when mental health was clenched behind doctrine, when divorce carried stigma, when a stoic man could implode without a single person noticing. They argued that prison would serve safety, but that the mind on trial wasn't monstrous, it was sick. What stands out now in retrospect is that sickness and calculation lived together that day, and the jury had to weigh both. The judge instructed carefully on insanity, diminished capacity, purposeful conduct. Purpose won. The verdict came back. Guilty on all 5 counts. Life imprisonment, parole, a question for bureaucracies he'd never navigate. He showed little visible reaction, a blink behind glasses, a mouth set in the same restrained line Bender had predicted. Outside, microphones waited for words that never came. In the interviews that followed, he returned to the same vocabulary: welfare, shame, moral decay, as if repeats could sand down edges. Parole boards later heard regret, but not ownership of cruelty, not an understanding that control, not care, directed his hand. The calculus he'd used, humiliation avoided by annihilation, had no rate of return the law could accept, and the theology he'd invoked didn't survive the cross-examination of reality. In Westfield, absence became architecture. Breezy Knoll was demolished after the 1972 fire, but people still slowed at the empty lot, telling newcomers about the stained glass and the sealed ballroom. A rumor surfaced that the window came from a church, a fitting irony for a house staged with hymns, though provenance was never confirmed. The neighborhood kept a scar where a family once moved through ordinary days. Surviving relatives carried grief that didn't resolve with the guilty verdict. Estates were argued, belongings dispersed, letters archived, churches split in quiet ways. Some parishioners leaned toward redemption, saying repentance should meet mercy. Others said justice required a boundary, that absolution without accountability enabled harm. The psychology of the moment is important. Belief communities often wrestle hardest when doctrine meets cruelty committed in doctrinal language. Investigators and criminologists turned the case into a study file. Forensic aging, once a niche craft, gained credibility because a sculptor captured not just anatomy, but habit. Identity theft without high technology, built from borrowed names, cash jobs, church anchors, became a model for how erasure works in plain sight. And in the literature on family annihilators, his profile sat beside other cases where rigidity, shame, and control overshadowed empathy, the household reduced to a ledger he could balance only through violence. Ethically, the knot tightened around his letters. He claimed salvation as motive, arguing that public humiliation would corrupt his children's souls and that killing spared them. Investigators considered motive versus meaning, and meaning kept collapsing under weight. Mercy doesn't align 4 bodies on sleeping bags. Protection doesn't pursue a son through multiple gunshots when he resists. The theology functioned as camouflage, familiar words draped over a need for control. He gave interviews from prison, careful and spare. He expressed regret, but not a full moral turn. He said he'd feared welfare, decay, a family judged by neighbors. He didn't speak about terror in a ballroom, about a mother's trust on a staircase. Parole boards heard him and marked the gap. He died in 2008, a long life by prison standards, leaving no confession that recentered the victims, only explanations that circled the same guarded phrases. What stands out now in retrospect is the banality of his second life. He mowed lawns, counted offerings, balanced accounts, and never told the truth. Routine hid atrocity like wallpaper over a cracked wall. Communities trusted the man who showed up on time. That trust is what he used first and last, which leaves one question. What do we do with a confession built to excuse? We keep the names of Patricia, John Jr., Frederick, Helen, and Alma at the center. We study the machinery, shame, control, staged piety, not to sensationalize, but to recognize early fractures before they break a house in silence. Let's get to story number 2. The handle turned, but the door resisted, like the house itself was holding its breath. Agents paused, registering the odor, the silence, the steady tick of a wall clock somewhere inside. No shouting, no movement, just stale air and a heaviness you can't mistake. Where was the attentive father, the trusted therapist? What was sealed beyond that threshold, and why now? He'd built a life that looked stable. Connecticut roots, Florida sunshine, smiling photos. But the ledger told a different story. To understand how the facade cracked, we need to go back to when success still seemed believable. Anthony and Megan built their lives around the language of recovery. Physical therapy isn't glamorous, but it's intimate, hands-on, measured in inches of progress and quiet milestones. Patients remembered him for patience, remembered her for persistence. In small-town Connecticut, that carried weight. Reputations grew incrementally, one knee, one back, one shoulder at a time, until the practice felt inevitable, enduring, safe. At the time, clients saw what they were meant to see: a marriage bound by work and purpose, children folded into routines, a household orbiting the clinic's schedule. The psychology of the moment is important. Caregivers learn to absorb other people's pain. They also learn to hide their own. So the story the town consumed was about competence, consistency, and care. And yet, what stands out now in retrospect is that competence can become a costume when money starts thinning the margins. Expansion in medical services looks clean on paper: more patients, more therapists, a second office. But the back end complicates fast. Insurance billing codes, pre-authorizations, pay or mix, reimbursement delays that turn weeks into months. For a while, the float covers the gap. Then back taxes appear, a landlord presses, equipment leases mature, and the accounts receivable spreadsheet reads like a promise you can't keep. He borrowed quietly, the way professionals do, convinced the next quarter would offset the last. That next quarter didn't arrive. Megan had chronic health issues that required management and that shaped their identity. Caretaking wasn't just the clinic's mission. It was home life. From the outside, it reinforced a narrative: this couple knows hardship. They're resilient. Inside, it may have hardened a belief that they could endure more than most, that they could bend deadlines and outlast storms. Magical thinking doesn't start loud. It starts with one deferred bill and one confident speech about catching up. Then came the pivot: Florida. The logic sounded reasonable: lower overhead, warmer climate, a reset that could bring new patients and a fresh start. Proximity to Orlando's constant influx of families suggested a stable client base. Friends heard about opportunity and sunshine. Vendors heard about delays and prorated payments. The family packed up, and with that, the old obligations followed like shadows stuck to their heels. Social media filled with ordinary markers: school drop-offs, birthdays, seasonal outings. Neighbors saw a devoted dad who waved, hauled groceries, kept to himself but never seemed troubled. The house looked lived in, modest, normal. That's the unsettling part. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. In financial collapses, normalcy lasts longer than you'd think, because appearance is a line of credit. Meanwhile, Connecticut didn't forget. Clients left behind asked about records. Landlords tallied arrears. Agencies sent letters to old addresses, then new ones. The money trail was dull and relentless. Small judgments, notices, late fees, a chorus of paper that followed him state to state. Insurance carriers flagged irregularities familiar to fraud investigators: billing for missed sessions, upcoded services, patterns that suggested the clinic's cash flow depended more on forms than on human bodies in a treatment room. No invented numbers here, just the pattern that professionals recognize: too many claims, too little corroboration. What nobody knew at the time, because it's never obvious in real time, was that administrative pressure was closing in. One lawsuit is irritating, two become heavy. Add inquiries from Medicaid overseers, phone calls unreturned, process servers making notes, and a person used to being trusted learns to avoid. Avoidance, repeated, becomes routine. He told people, next week, the way a therapist tells a patient, one more rep, meant to motivate, not deceive, until it becomes both. The move south didn't erase the ledger. It only compressed the timeline. He was still the friendly clinician, still the husband speaking the language of care, and that mattered to everyone who wanted to believe the best. But here's the twist. The more he hid, the fewer real options remained. The caretaker identity, once a source of pride, became a trap. If you admit the clinic is failing, what happens to the patients who trust you? To the spouse who relies on your steadiness? To the children who read your face before they read the mail? Neighbors noticed nothing unusual. Routine is a blanket that hides shivering. From their perspective, this was a family in transition, finding rhythm in a new state. Meanwhile, across states, spreadsheets accumulated and investigators drew lines between addresses, dates, deposit slips. He traveled back and forth, making promises that bought days, not months. Each delay invited the next, and each next narrowed the space to breathe. What stands out now in hindsight is how ordinary it all looked. A pleasant photo, a full calendar on the fridge, a clinic flyer in a glove box. But the math underneath didn't add up. And when the numbers stop agreeing with the story starts to fracture, quietly at first, then faster, until silence replaces explanation. To understand the pressure inside that house, you follow the paper, not the headlines, the forms. In healthcare, the margin lives inside codes, CPT numbers, units, modifiers that turn 15 minutes into billable time. Investigators later reviewed patterns that raised flags, claims for sessions that patients didn't remember attending, treatments billed at higher complexity than notes supported, repetition that suggested templates, not individualized care. None of this is sensational. It's paperwork that, when multiplied, becomes money you don't truly have. Stakes are human here. When a clinician pads a claim to float payroll, the justifications sound noble, but insurers notice rhythm. Too many identical notes, too many hours squeezed into a day. Auditors play a simple game, reconcile what was billed against what could have happened. And then there were the no-shows that somehow became treated, the travel days that looked suspiciously productive on paper. In hindsight, the clinic's survival strategy resembled a slow siphon. Meanwhile, legitimate debts piled up. Back taxes, the kind that don't evaporate, accrued penalties, rent lagged, equipment leases clicked forward, indifferent to excuses. Relatives helped with small loans that became large resentments. Rent-to-own agreements, easy to start, punishing to break, added monthly weight. The psychology of the moment is important. When you've built a self-image around competence, admitting insolvency feels like personal collapse, so denial becomes a coping tool, dressed up as optimism. He promised next week to everyone. The landlord, the vendor, the client owed a refund. Each next week was borrowed time against a ledger that didn't forgive. Process servers began leaving notes. Calls from carriers shifted tone, from friendly reminders to compliance language. Letters included phrases like recoupment and overpayment review. These aren't abstract threats, they're withdrawal slips against future reimbursements, cutting off the oxygen of cash flow before you even touch it. But here's the twist. Private avoidance collides with public systems. Medicaid oversight doesn't move fast, but it moves. Civil suits from landlords and vendors don't coordinate, but they stack. An investigation in one jurisdiction doesn't announce itself to neighbors in another, but it builds a file. While the family posted ordinary life, spreadsheets at distant desks acquired tabs labeled anomalies, timeline, provider responses. The trap wasn't a dramatic raid, it was the administrative equivalent of tide, slow, relentless, rising. Isolation took root. He traveled back to Connecticut, chasing revenue and reassuring old patients that the transition was temporary. He assured Florida contacts that expansion delays were normal. He told family members he'd refinance, consolidate, pivot. Magical thinking thrives in this space. One contract, one settlement, one busy season will reset the board. The gambler's fallacy applies cleanly. After enough losses, a win feels due. Instead, the hole deepened. Insurance carriers, unlike individual creditors, can claw back. When audits identify suspect claims, future payments get withheld to balance the books. That starves a small practice quickly. Accounts receivable looked robust on paper. In reality, the money was earmarked for recoupment. The clinic's bank balance became a mirage, numbers that existed only until the next reconciliation removed them. If you've ever watched a sandcastle meet a wave, you know the motion, solid one moment, gone the next. Warnings weren't subtle. Certified letters arrived requiring documentation, appointment logs, therapist signatures, progress notes, justifying build intensities. When notes didn't match claims, exposure widened. He responded late, or not at all. Avoidance became muscle memory. Phone calls went to voicemail. Process servers documented attempts. Civil complaints stacked where business mail once held appointment reminders. Silence can be strategic, but here it read as confirmation. And then there was the human cost inside the home. Megan's health required steadiness, insurance forms of a different kind, medication schedules, predictable income. The identity of caretaker and provider pressed against a private reality of shortfalls. He controlled access to information, telling her, according to later statements, that problems were temporary. The caretaker myth hardens here. If you're the one who solves, you can't admit you're the one who failed. Agents, quietly, closed in. Not with television drama, but with subpoenas, data pulls, interviews. Former employees were asked about scheduling patterns. Patients were asked to verify dates. Landlords recounted partial payments and promises. The mosaic sharpened. What nobody knew at the time was how close the administrative reckoning had come to the family's front door. When reimbursement stopped and recoupment started, payroll and rent competed with groceries, and groceries often lose. The plan he nursed, stretched the float until new revenue arrived, collapsed under math. The more he hid, the fewer real options remained. Bankruptcy would have meant disclosure. Negotiation would have required admission. A sale needed transparent books. He tried to keep all plates spinning, instead of letting one drop publicly to save the rest. That decision would matter. It compressed pressure inward, into a sealed environment where explanations could be postponed, where emails could be ignored, where the story could be controlled. December brought a quiet inflection. Messages to clients grew formulaic. Illness, delays, rescheduling after the holidays, reimbursement halted on key lines, utility notices shifted color. The eviction clock started to tick. Unknown to neighbors, a map existed elsewhere. Dates, balances, audit findings, upcoming service of process. The exterior looked stable because appearances cost nothing. Inside, the ledger dictated terms. And then, no more, next week's, only silence. In mid-December, the routine thinned. Clients who were used to punctual reminders received vague texts, identical in phrasing, about illness running through the house. Appointments were cancelled in batches, then pushed after the holidays. For a service business, December cancellations can be normal. Here, the uniformity felt unusual and unsettling. Copy-paste sentences, timestamps that clustered late at night, apologies without specifics. Friends messaged Megan and heard little back. A couple of exchanges arrived with the same tone, clipped and formal, as if drafted once and reused. The psychology of the moment is important. When someone is spinning too many plates, they don't improvise, they recycle. The digital footprint flattened, fewer photos, fewer spontaneous replies, long gaps where there should have been ordinary chatter about school or schedules. Silence can be innocent. Patterns of silence rarely are. Across town, deliveries stacked on the porch. Flyers from neighborhood services tucked under a doormat that wasn't lifted. Curtains settled into a permanent, half-drawn position. A neighbor noted the minivan's position barely changed. When it did, it was brief. The house had the feel of a stage set between scenes. Lights off, furniture untouched. From the street, nothing screamed crisis. That's the point of staged normalcy. It reads like a paused life, not a fractured one. Money left its marks in administrative shadows. Utilities sent warnings in progressive colors. Rent slipped another month, then another. The landlord, already juggling partial payments, prepared eviction filings. Meanwhile, in Connecticut, landlords calculated arrears from previous spaces. Former patients asked for records to transfer care. Responses were delayed, then deflected. The past and present echoed each other, promises deferred, obligations accumulating unread in a growing stack of mail. While neighbors in Florida saw a quiet holiday season, investigators in other states mapped movements. Medicaid program integrity teams compiled spreadsheets of claims and dates. Civil attorneys traced addresses for service. Process servers documented attempts, noting the same detail again and again. No answer at the door, blinds closed, hours of no movement. None of this is dramatic in isolation. Together, it's a time-lapse of withdrawal. Inside, according to later accounts, the family was sick. That phrase did heavy lifting, covering missed calls, missed school days, and missed income. It gave him room to manage narrative and logistics. He sent messages from a single device, controlling the cadence, the words, the excuses. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, the silence was curated, a maintenance plan to keep outsiders satisfied while the interior story narrowed to a private script. The digital traces told a similar story. Banking activity dipped to essentials. A few payments posted, then reversed, the kind of overdraft dance that signals scarcity. Emails auto-responded with illness notices. Social media paused on a cheerful, neutral image, something evergreen enough not to demand updates. These are small choices, but in hindsight, they look like sandbags against a rising river, not enough to stop the water, just enough to delay the breach. Meanwhile, across states, people who depended on the clinic faced their own uncertainty. Connecticut clients waited for discharge notes that never arrived, while Florida patients watched appointments disappear into the vague future of after the holidays. Employees, those who'd stayed, waited on pay that came late, or didn't come at all. Calls went to voicemail. The phrase, "out of an abundance of caution," appeared in one message about illness. It sounded safe. It also sounded rehearsed. The home itself became a sealed environment. Garbage days passed with minimal curb activity. A package sat long enough to collect dew rings. The porch light timing never changed, as if the switch had been left to a routine no one was following. A Christmas decoration, once plugged in, stayed dark. None of these details, alone, prove anything. Together, they suggest an interior that wasn't living in real time. What happened during those weeks is partly documented, partly inferred from the aftermath. We know there were cancellations. We know there were unanswered knocks. We know investigators in the fraud matter were approaching a point where contact was required. We also know that when communication stops, people project courtesy onto silence for longer than they should, especially when the person they're waiting on has a history of care and competence. That deference bought days. Those days mattered. By late December, the excuses had exhausted their usefulness. A final wave of messages offered reassurance without dates. Then nothing. The phone stopped being an instrument of delay and became an object to be ignored. The neighborhood rolled through the holidays, lights blinking on quiet cul-de-sacs, while the house stayed dim. Outside, the world honored routine. Inside, the narrative tightened. When federal agents finally approached the door in January, they expected paperwork, not tragedy. They were there because of finances, compliance, codes. The smell that met them wasn't on any form. The door resisted, as if the house had learned to hold its breath. Staged normalcy had done its work. It carried the charade to the threshold. Beyond it, ordinary explanations fell away, and the investigation crossed from columns and claims into a chilling mystery. Agents arrived with a warrant that spoke the language of healthcare fraud, records, devices, correspondence. They did not come prepared for silence that pressed against their ears. The lock gave with effort, the air felt heavy, and the smell announced a different kind of investigation. Inside, lights were dim, blinds fixed, surfaces strangely neat. It looked like someone had tidied with the expectation of being judged by appearances, not by what lingered out of sight. They moved room to room with measured steps. No shouting, no chaos, just a staged minimalism, laundry folded but not put away, dishes rinsed but not stacked, trash contained. Attempts to delay discovery can look like routine housekeeping, but the pattern here felt curated, like a set preserved beyond normal use. A single fan ran in a corner, humming to itself. It did not move enough air to matter. Anthony appeared tired, as if he had rehearsed exhaustion. He was compliant, hands visible, voice low. He answered questions, then drifted into silence, then offered more, as if testing which version would be easiest to live with. Agents who expected a provider protective of files met a man who did not resist. He directed them to what they asked for with a flat efficiency, and yet his eyes kept landing on the same fixed points. Doorways, a hallway, the edge of a table, markers of a story he did not want to narrate out loud. Initial statements were soft, passive, cloaked in communal language. He spoke of a pact, of shared decisions, of an ending that had been discussed. He said timelines were blurred by illness, that sleep and wakefulness had run together. He used phrases that removed direct agency. It happened, we decided, it was time. Investigators, trained to extract verbs, kept asking who did what and when. His answers slid. Time shifted. What had been last week became before Christmas, then after. The story bent around responsibility like a river around rock. The forensic reality began to harden almost immediately. There were signs of staging, items placed to suggest routine that did not match decay, notes positioned in ways that read like presentation more than spontaneous writing. Simple things betrayed chronology, the state of food, the temperature of rooms, the condition of linens. Time leaves fingerprints on objects, and those fingerprints contradicted parts of his tale. He mentioned Megan in clinical language, as if reciting a case history, her chronic illness, her pain levels, the weight of long-term management. He inferred consent, described mercy. But the physical facts did not support a peaceful narrative. The cause mechanism, referenced carefully in reports, suggested an escalation rather than resignation. Indicators pointed to planning and follow-through, not a sudden pact. In the aftermath, he remained in the home, moving through spaces like a caretaker, performing maintenance on a scene rather than a partner seeking help. That mattered. A notebook sat where someone would be sure to find it. Pages contained the vocabulary of surrender, sin, debt, relief, absolution. There were references to financial erasure, to a ledger wiped clean. Religious fatalism threaded through the lines, the suggestion that suffering had a purpose, that ending it was a form of control. One detail stood out in hindsight, the neatness of certain entries, the deliberate structure, as if composed for an audience larger than himself. Confessions written for others often tidy motives. They rarely match timelines. Agents catalogued devices, gathered mail, logged identification numbers. While that happened, he cycled through tones, resigned, defensive, helpful, then suddenly distant. He asked for water, appreciated small courtesies, then delivered another fragment of explanation, slightly altered, like trying keys in a lock. He emphasized illness, minimized conflict, and framed himself as the one who bore the hard choices. The psychology of control was evident. If he could define the narrative, he might reclaim a kind of authority the finances had taken. Investigators pressed specifics. Who sent the last message from Megan's phone? Why were certain medications accounted for and others not? Why did power usage drop in a pattern that contradicted his claimed sequence of events? Each answer widened gaps. He could not explain the mismatched dates on digital documents, the absence of fresh receipts, the way the thermostat logs created a time-stamped outline of inactivity. Clinical evidence undermined the story he preferred, the mercy script, the shared decision, the blurred timeline. What nobody knew at the time, beyond those walls, was how much of the financial record would later anchor the case. The fraud warrant brought them in, but it was the domestic scene that turned their roles. He seemed to understand this shift. In one breath, he acknowledged responsibility. In the next, he retreated to language about fate and covenant. Admissions appeared, then receded, replaced by vaguer claims that things got away from him, that he had tried to keep the family safe from outside forces. There were notes that read like instruction, who to contact, what to forgive, how to interpret the ending. That performative layer clashed with the physical state of the home. If the plan had been mutual, why the staging to delay discovery? Why the silence to friends who would have offered help? Investigators asked those questions without accusation, letting the weight of contradiction sit between them. In the end, his words kept changing, but the ledger did not. Bank records, audit letters, recoupment notices, they formed a timeline that resisted revision. The home told its own story through dust, temperature, and time. And as agents closed their folders, the case moved from quiet administrative pressure to a criminal narrative that would now be examined in public. In the first interview room, he looked small against cinder block and fluorescent light. The air carried disinfectant. The clock clicked audibly, and the tape rolled. He began with resignation. Yes, things had ended. Yes, it was planned. Yes, he had been the one to see it through. He spoke in gentle, almost therapeutic cadence, as if still counseling a patient, framing the outcome as relief from burden. But here is the twist. Within an hour, qualifiers crept in. Maybe it was not exactly that way. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe he had misunderstood what others wanted. Investigators did not argue. They narrowed the frame. Walk us through the days. Sleep, meals, medications, phone usage, minute by minute. He filled gaps with abstractions. We were sick. Time lost meaning. Everyone agreed. When pressed for verbs, he retreated into passives. It happened. It was done. Decisions were made. The psychology of control is visible in the grammar. Remove the subject, and you dilute the act. They shifted tactics to communications. Who texted from Megan's phone on specific dates? Why did the phrasing mirror his style from earlier messages? He said she dictated. He said she was nearby. He said he copied her words. The linguistic analysis, short sentences, certain punctuation, suggested a single author. Could stress account for uniformity? Perhaps. But then came the metadata. Timestamps aligned with his device being active, her device idle. Silence where there should have been noise. In the second interview, the mercy narrative sharpened. He described end-of-life compassion, described a pact born from pain, and recast himself as executor of a shared will. He emphasized suffering and faith, spoke about absolution, debt erased, a ledger reset by sacrifice. Investigators listened, then slid across a folder, power usage logs, thermostat data, delivery timestamps. The sequence did not match his claimed order. The house told a colder story, literally. Heat dips, lights off, a stillness at odds with his timeline. Clinical evidence undercut the peaceful frame. Without graphic detail, the indicators pointed to planning, staging, and post-event maintenance. He had stayed, moved through rooms, managed appearances. If this was mutual, why curate delay? If this was mercy, why not seek immediate help? He said he needed time to pray. He said he needed time to write. He said he was waiting for a sign. The gaps widened with every answer. What stands out in hindsight is the performative layer of his confession. He wanted to be understood as caretaker and victim, not perpetrator. He reached for language that softened agency, covenant, release, love. Yet each time investigators asked a direct question: who administered what? Who physically acted? Who decided the order? The answers blurred. He conceded, then retracted, then rephrased. Admission and retraction formed a rhythm that felt rehearsed, not spontaneous. They asked about motive beyond mercy. He invoked ruin, the fraud case, the audits, the recoupment letters. He framed them as an oncoming storm that would take everything. He said he could not let outsiders dismantle his family. He said he feared humiliation. He said he had failed everyone who depended on him. The caretaker myth hardened here. Rather than surrender control to courts and creditors, he chose a private resolution, then narrated it as compassion. Meanwhile, forensic anchors accumulated. Search histories revealed keywords connected to methods and timelines. Purchases matched those searches. Device pings located him within the home during critical windows, while expected outgoing communications from others did not exist. A simple analogy helped the jury later. A crossword you claim to have solved with friends, but only your handwriting appears in every square. Could stress explain the uniform script, perhaps in small parts, not across the grid? Investigators returned to Megan's last known communications. Friends described her as responsive, even on hard days. In December, replies stopped abruptly. When messages did go out, they carried his cadence, formal, careful, oddly generic. One friend flagged it privately at the time but deferred to the illness story. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, it was curated. The third interview turned defensive. He questioned forensic certainty, suggested contamination, raised conspiratorial undertones about agencies punishing him for billing errors. He framed the fraud pressure as persecution. Investigators countered with monotone facts, audits, timestamps, statements from landlords, bank flags. He pivoted again, this time to fate, God's plan. Tests of faith. A trial he had failed, but nobly. The psychology of the moment is important. When identity is built on competence and care, collapse threatens the self. To preserve a narrative of goodness, he constructed a confession that performs virtue while dodging the core act. Caretaker and victim, never aggressor. But the room did not accept theatre. Timelines do not flinch. By the time interviews concluded, the story had fractured into versions: mercy, accident, pact, providence, none fully aligned with evidence. What remained constant was control. Control of devices, control of messages, control of the home. The administrative case had uncovered a financial pattern. The interrogations exposed a psychological one. Court would force a single, public version. The ledger would sit beside the confession, and jurors would decide which spoke the truth. Jury selection moved slowly, careful screens for biases about faith, medicine, and the death of a spouse. The charges were stark, multiple counts of homicide, with the parallel healthcare fraud matter noted but separated, like a shadow case informing motive without distracting the panel. The prosecution framed it simply in opening statements: control, debt, and a curated narrative meant to delay discovery. The defense answered with pressure and illness, a family overwhelmed, a caregiver making tragic, misunderstood decisions. What stands out now in retrospect is how little spectacle was needed. The case lived in paper and time. Prosecutors built a spine out of timelines, bank records, audit letters, power usage, delivery scans. A witness from an insurance carrier explained recoupment with calm precision, how flagged claims strangled cash flow, how letters warned of clawbacks. A Medicaid investigator walked jurors through charts of billing anomalies, never sensational, just steady pins on a board. The message landed, the financial tide had turned, and he knew it. Then came the technicians. A digital forensics analyst outlined metadata from phones and tablets. Messages sent by Megan in December mirrored his phrasing and originated from the same IP blocks as his device sessions. Timestamps pinned activity to hours when he claimed everyone was incapacitated. A utility representative explained thermostat logs, heat lowered in a pattern that contradicted his timeline of events. Jurors watched a simple graph, peaks and valleys, and heard the analyst say, "This is when the house went quiet." The defense leaned on reasonable doubt. They highlighted missing certainties, no single, definitive forensic moment presented in isolation, gaps in exact sequencing, the absence of live witnesses to intent. They emphasized Megan's chronic illness, suggested conversations about end of life, floated ambiguity around consent. They pressed chain of custody questions on devices, asked whether stress could standardize phrasing, whether grief could scramble time perception. They leaned into the caretaker frame, a man cracked by audits and illness, grasping for compassion in a collapsing world. But here is the twist. Each theory required the jury to accept his language while ignoring the houses. Scene reconstruction specialists described staging indicators without graphic detail, placement of items, the tidiness inconsistent with ordinary living, the fan running without purpose. A medical examiner, clinical and measured, testified to cause mechanisms and sequencing in terms that rejected a peaceful pact. The tone stayed restrained, but the implications were firm: planning, execution, and post-event maintenance over an extended window. Witnesses filled out the mosaic. A landlord described partial payments and promises, a cadence of next week that never came. A former employee testified about appointment logs that did not match hours in the clinic, about templated notes that felt too clean. Patients from Connecticut recalled appointment cancellations and missing records. None of it was dramatic alone, but every voice added weight to motive: mounting debt, administrative pressure, identity at stake. The notebook mattered. Prosecutors read selected lines aloud, the vocabulary of sin, debt, and absolution, the fantasy of erasure. Religious experts were not called, the words stood on their own. The state argued the notebook was performance, a document that tried to launder agency through faith and fate. The defense countered that it revealed a man in spiritual crisis, driven by mercy, not malice. The jury watched him on the recorded interviews, heard the shifts, admission, then retraction, then a softer retelling. The rhythm sounded less like truth than calibration. Cross-examinations sharpened the edges. When the defense pressed the forensic analyst about possible metadata glitches, the answer stayed calm. Anomalies exist. Patterns decide. When they challenged the medical examiner on exact times, the reply returned to physiology's limits, then to consistency across indicators. The prosecution did not overreach. They kept returning to the ledger: audits, clawbacks, lawsuits lining up like storm fronts. He could not withstand public exposure. Therefore, he chose a private resolution. In closing, the state connected motive to method, a caretaker identity that could not survive failure, a financial reckoning that would remove control, a decision to end the narrative on his terms, then stage and delay. They reminded jurors of the house's testimony: temperature drops, lights, the curated neatness, and the device's chorus: one author, one hand on the keys. The defense asked for mercy through doubt, argued for the fog of illness and despair, asked jurors to see a man cornered by systems larger than him. Deliberations did not take long. The verdicts landed heavy, guilty on each homicide count. The judge's tone was grave, not theatrical. Intent, the court said, was written into preparation and aftermath, into messages sent to mislead, into staging that postponed discovery. The fraud case, still parallel, hovered as context, not as proof. Sentencing followed the law's hard line: life terms that stretched beyond any hope of parole. In the aftermath, defense signaled appeals, questioning digital interpretations and narrative framing. Some records remained sealed for procedural reasons. Others entered the public file. For the community, the verdict fixed a story that had floated between versions. For the court, it resolved a chilling mystery into a legal truth. Control, not mercy, drove what happened behind that quiet door. The first wave hit the people who knew only the smiling dad. Teachers pieced together the days of absence, the polite emails that had sounded routine, and felt a chill they could not shake. Neighbors stood at the curb, looking at a house that had seemed ordinary, and struggled to reconcile potlucks and carpool lines with a scene police tape now defined. In small communities, grief travels by word of mouth, and this story carried disbelief inside it. Former patients felt a different jolt. They had trusted hands-on care, weeks of incremental work, and now had to process that their therapist's name would live beside headlines, not progress notes. Some described guilt for missing warning signs, though there were none to see. The cognitive dissonance was real, the helpful dad image, the calm clinician voice, and, in hindsight, a curated normalcy that concealed a collapse. Money left the next set of ripples. Civil suits followed the verdict like aftershocks. Landlords pursued unpaid rent. Vendors sought judgments for equipment leases. Liens landed on what remained of the business entities. Medicaid sought recoupment on flagged claims, a methodical clawback that does not care about reputation. Bank accounts that looked stable on paper months earlier were already thin. Now they were subject to orders. For employees, closure meant unemployment, resumes explaining a workplace they never imagined collapsing. The clinics did not simply close, they were dismantled. Patient records needed transferring, a task complicated by missing staff and legal holds. Administrators triaged what can be released, to whom, under what authority. For patients, mid-treatment, interruption mattered. A rehab plan is not a pamphlet, it is momentum. Lost weeks became stiff joints, regressed progress, new appointments with unfamiliar providers who had to rebuild context from scratch. System questions rose quickly. Oversight had identified irregularities, but why did it take so long for pressure to reach the front door? Program integrity units are under-resourced. Auditors handle stacks of cases. Civil processes move at the pace of service and response. Each delay widened harm. You hear this in quiet conversations among investigators. With more staff, earlier intervention might have forced a different crisis. Public, painful, but non-lethal. That is speculation, not absolution, but it matters for policy. The psychology of the moment is important. Debt does not explode, it compresses. It turns creative problem-solving into rationalizations, delays into self-justified strategy. The caretaker myth thrives in that compression. He told himself he was protecting the family from humiliation, from outside dismantling, from the administrative erasure that audits and lawsuits represent. In reality, isolation removed options. Systems that could have intervened earlier did not have the speed or the proximity. Media coverage amplified contradictions. Sensational angles are easy. The perfect family, the dark truth, the religious notes, the house. But the quieter pattern deserved more attention. The incremental failures, the avoidance that became habit, the administrative tide that rose without sirens. Responsible reporting highlighted timelines, sources, and the forensic anchors, resisting the urge to fill gaps with invented motives. Others were not so careful. For families nearby, the spectacle felt like an additional wound. Community leaders tried to make sense of it. Faith groups held vigils focused on grief rather than theory. School counselors managed whispers and fear among students who understood only that adults can vanish. Former patients compared notes, consoling each other about progress they had made under care that now felt contaminated by the ending. The consensus was not neat. People wanted a single cause. They got a lattice of pressures, a private psychology, and a courtroom's version of truth. What nobody knew at the time were the small junctions where intervention might have nudged the path. A transparent practice audit before expansion. A landlord's earlier, firmer boundary. A professional board review when billing patterns shifted. Mental health access, presented not as failure, but as standard for clinicians under strain. None of these erase responsibility. They simply acknowledge that systems, like people, have chances to act. Step back, and a grim pattern comes into focus. A dual life template where outward caretaking hides inward deceit. Debt as slow violence, narrowing choices, oversight tools too slow to meet private collapse, and a community left reading two stories about one man, neither fully able to absorb the other. Step back, and the pattern is not mysterious. It is control, layered over image, driven by debt that worked like slow violence. Outwardly, he embodied caretaking. Inwardly, he curated information, filtered messages, and framed every delay as temporary. That dual life template thrives in communities built on trust, because helpfulness buys deference, and deference buys time. The psychology of the moment is important. Control promises safety when numbers do not. Image promises belonging when reputation wobbles. Debt compresses both, distorting judgment, rewarding secrecy, punishing transparency. Think of it like hypoxia at altitude. Subtle at first, then confusing, then fatal if you do not descend. He did not descend. He tightened the mask. Erasure followed. not just of ledgers, but of voices that contradicted the narrative. Devices centralized communication. Notes tried to sanctify decisions. Staging muted immediate discovery. This was the caretaker myth taken to an extreme. Protect by deciding, decide by isolating, isolate by rewriting motive as mercy. Communities miss these signs because they are ordinary. A reliable dad, a competent clinician, a family that looks intact. We expect danger to announce itself. It rarely does. The lesson is not cynicism, it is verification. Financial transparency in small practices. Routine wellness check-ins for caregivers under strain. Earlier, resourced oversight that treats anomalies as smoke, not paperwork. Nothing excuses the outcome. But prevention lives in systems that narrow secrecy. Dual signature finances, board audits before expansion, normalized mental health access for medical owners, and community norms that make asking, "Are you okay?" really feel procedural, not accusatory.